Right, what are we talking about today? Yeah, the Women's World Cup expansion. Now, thinking about this, well, before I give my thoughts, here's a lowdown. So, for those of you who don't know, and if you don't know, where have you been hiding? The Women's World Cup will be expanding from its current 32 teams to 48 teams, which is exactly what the Men's World Cup will be doing as of 2022, 2026 even. So my thoughts on that is that looking at how the last Women's World Cup went in 2023, it was a very successful tournament in terms of viewership, along along with how many people it reached. But looking at the expansion, I have a bit of a criticism because when the World Cup first, I'm talking about the Women's World Cup. So yeah, so when the Women's World Cup first expanded to 24 sides from 16 sides back in 2015, I thought to myself, we're just going to see a load of one-sided games, and lo and behold, we saw that. Like, we saw Germany thrash Ivory Coast 11-0 in 2015, and 4 years later, most notably, we saw USA annihilate Thailand 13-0. And that got me thinking, is is women's football really ready for that sort of growth? But owing to the success of the last World Cup in Australia and New Zealand, that then told me that women's football is ready for this kind of growth. Now, the Women's World Cup first expanded for 32 teams at the last tournament. Again, which I thought to myself, is this going to have a load of one-sided games? It did have a few one-sided games, but not a lot. I mean, we even saw a new champion out of that, and the Women's World Cup hasn't seen a new champion since the 2011 tournament. And that got me thinking that through expansion, women's football can continue to grow. Like, of course, the next 32 team Women's World Cup will be in 2027, which will be the last Women's World Cup to feature 32 teams. But I really do have to question whether women's football really is ready for this type of growth. And I know I said earlier that women's football is ready, but I'm just currently thinking to myself that, is women's football running before it can walk? I don't know, honestly. Like, using the point of one-sided scorelines, that's fair enough. Like, I think to myself that if we really want women's football to succeed, then each game has to be competitive from the off. Because what we can't be seeing is a load of one-sided scorelines. Because let's be honest, nobody's going to enjoy that. And I think back to when the men's World Cup first expanded to 32 teams back in 2002, I think it was. And we saw Germany defeat Saudi Arabia 8-0. And initially, people were thinking, okay, this is a bad idea. But since then, the men's World Cup has improved leaps and bounds since then. So, with that being said, could the same happen with the women's game? like, what are your thoughts on the Women's World Cup expansion? Is it a good idea or is it not a good idea? Another thing I have in mind is that one way that the Women's World Cup can be different from the men's game is by having an alternate format. Like, the Men's World Cup will see 12 groups of 4, but I'd like to see the Women's World Cup do something different. Like, it can have a 32-team group stage, but here's where it gets to 48 teams. Like, it could be done a bit like the FA Cup, where lesser teams play in the earlier rounds, and then the bigger and the medium teams come in at the later round, which will be the group stage. Like, for me, that's something I'd like to see. Because women's football, it doesn't have to follow the same path as the men's game. Like, I genuinely believe there is opportunity for women's football to do something different. Like, you see what's going on in the men's game, but it's like the people controlling football, they think that whatever happens in men's football has to also happen in women's football in the name of equality. And I just think to myself, nah, it doesn't have to be like that. Women's football can do its own thing. But up next, we have the 2027 World Cup, which I believe is being held in Brazil, which will be the second and last Women's World Cup to feature 32 teams. But I'd like to know what your thoughts on this expansion are. Do you think an expansion is a step in the right direction for women's football? Or do you think that the Women's World Cup should remain at 32 teams for the foreseeable future? One thing that's just come to mind is that maybe rather than groups, there could be like divisions. So you can have divisions of 4. So to create like a promotion relegation type of thing within women's football. And I'm aware that promotion and relegation is a thing in the Women's Nations League. But what about the World Cup? Could promotion and relegation work for women's football in the global stage? I mean, we see it on the continental stage with Nations League, but how could it work on a global stage, if at all it could work? Like, I'm just throwing things out there, because I think looking at the product of women's football, I genuinely believe it can do its own thing rather than copying whatever the men are doing. But yeah, I've deviated from the main topic now, but I'm just thinking a lot about how women's football can improve. But it's getting up to 10 minutes now, so I'm going to wrap up the video here now. So, Women's World Cup expansion. Is it a good idea? Is it not a good idea? If so, why? If not, why? And how do you think women's football on the international stage can be improved? I'd like to know what you think.